Hi guys, it's Miss Simon. So I wanted to make this video today to help you guys out with grammar. So we're moving on in grammar now past those verbs be and have, and we're going to do a skill that I noticed that a lot of us could use, especially in our writing. So we're going to talk about commas. Commas in a series, so the difference between a comma and a semicolon and when to use them and when we should be using commas, because there's a lot of times in our writing that we should have commas that we might not know about. So I think that this skill is going to help a lot of us, especially in our writing and in our essays, okay? And hopefully you can apply some of these skills in your essay that you're writing right now. All right, so let me share my screen with you. Make sure you have your grammar notebook out because you're going to be taking some notes in grammar. All right, so we're going to be talking about punctuation in compounds and complex sentences, okay? When I talk about punctuation, I mean commas and semicolons. That's what we're going to focus on today. So commas and semicolons are punctuation marks used to separate three or more items within a series or a list, okay? So I want us to go ahead and copy this. This is going to be at the top, okay, because it's going to be like your new section because we are moving on. Okay, so make sure you have that down. Okay, and we need to also know that commas and semicolons are punctuation marks used to separate three or more items in a series or a list. Okay, so when we're talking about this specifically in your writing, I can see when you are listing your three reasons that you're going to be talking about in your introduction, when you're listing those three reasons, you can separate them by a comma, okay, because you are telling the reader what your three reasons are, okay? So instead of putting those three reasons in separate sentences, you need to put them all together in one sentence. So for example, I would use my sentence that I'm talking about is students should have more recess time because they can focus better, comma, it allows them to be more social, comma, and they live healthier lives. All of that can go in one sentence because it is a series or a list. Okay, we're going to do some more examples of that. All right, so we can use a comma to separate items within a series or list, and then a semicolon is used when the items in the series already contain a comma, okay? So in your right, if you already have a comma in a list of things, then you need to use a semicolon to separate them instead of a comma. And we don't see semicolons used a lot, okay? We are going to see how they're used today, but they're going to be specifically, we see them usually with dates. So go ahead and write that down as well. All right, so let's look at a couple examples. Again, if you're not done, make sure you pause the video and you can replay it. So commas in a series, okay? So go ahead and write this example down. I ate a sandwich, an apple, and celery for lunch, okay? So in this sentence, we can see that we have two commas, okay? We have a comma here separating sandwich and apple, and a comma here separating apple and celery, okay? Because we are listing three things that the person ate for lunch. So we use a comma to separate them. Okay, just like we just talked about when you're listing your three reasons, you should use a comma to separate those. Okay, then now let's look at semicolons. Like I said, semicolons are not used a lot, okay, so we're not going to see them often, okay, but one way we are going to see them is in a date, okay, so we will meet in the cafeteria on Wednesday, February 7th, Friday, February 9th, and Monday, February 12th. So when we write dates, okay, we put commas to separate, okay, the day from the month. All right, but now we're listing three different times they need to meet in the cafeteria. So not only are we going to be including commas between those dates, but we're going to need to separate the dates themselves. So that's where we're going to use semicolons, okay? So make sure you write this example down as well, please, the whole sentence, okay? Because notice we need commas separating the day from the month, but then we need semicolons because there is three different days here. Okay, so commas go from separating the day and the month, and the semicolon is separating those three different actual days. Okay, so here we have both comma and the semicolon. All right, where in this first one, we just have commas. All right, moving on. We also see commas used in something we call compound and complex sentences, okay? Compound and complex sentences, we already talked about this year, but we're gonna review that so we can remember that skill. So a compound sentence has two independent clauses joined by a coordinating conjunction and a comma, okay? So let's write that down. A compound sentence has two independent clauses joined by a conjunction and a comma. Okay. And again, we're going to review this, but just so we know, remember, independent, if someone is independent, it means they are by themselves, okay? So when we have independent clauses make sense on their own, okay? So they can stand alone because they make sense. So compound sentence just has two independent clauses joined by a comma and a conjunction word. Conjunction word is like and, but, or, so, okay? And then we have a complex sentence has one dependent clause joined to an independent clause separated by a comma. Okay? So a compound has two independent clauses, so two things that can stand alone, but a complex has one independent clause and one dependent clause. Okay? We already know independent can stand alone, but if something is considered a dependent clause, all of you guys are considered dependents because you depend on your parents, okay? So a dependent clause is quite similar. A dependent clause cannot stand on its own. If we were to just put it by itself, it does not make sense on its own, okay? So the difference is a complex sentence has a dependent and an independent, where a compound just has two independents. And we talked about that earlier this school year. Okay. Now, specifically, I want to look at those commas and where those commas need to go. So I'm going to stop this screen share with you because I've written the examples down and I want to kind of go in more depth with them. But you are going to write this stuff down in your notes as well, please. Okay. So let's first look at independent clauses. Remember, we just talked about independent clauses can stand on their own. Okay. So this is an example of a compound sentence. Okay. Layla reads a novel, but Jack watches TV, okay? So these are two independent clauses. Let's look at them separately. Layla reads a novel. That makes sense on its own. Jack watches TV. That makes sense on its own. So if we were to combine them together, in order to combine them together, you need a comma and a conjunction word. So here we used but. So we put a comma and then but. So our comma needs to go before our conjunction to combine those two sentences. And we can also look at this, guys. Where are we pausing in the sentence? Layla reads a novel, but Jack watches TV. Okay? Where we're pausing there, we're going to kind of need that comma. Okay? So remember, this is a compound sentence, two independent clauses, because both of these can stand on their own. And we join them together with a comma and a conjunction word. Okay, make sure you have that down in your notes as an example. Now we're going to look at a dependent clause. Remember, dependent clauses are in complex sentences because complex sentences have a dependent clause and an independent clause joined by a comma. Again, we're looking at the specific place of the comma. Okay, remember, dependent clauses cannot stand on their own. Okay, so let's look at this example sentence. Okay, although Layla asked Jack to be quiet, he turned up the TV, okay? So although Layla asked Jack to be quiet, although what, okay? Although Layla asked Jack to be quiet, that cannot stand on its own. It depends on the other part of the sentence. So that is considered a dependent clause, okay? Then we have the part of the sentence that is an independent clause. It can stand on its own. He turned up the volume, okay? Well, he turned up the volume makes sense on its own, so it would be an independent clause. So our comma in this sentence needs to go between the dependent clause and the independent clause. So although Layla asked Jack to be quiet, comma, he turned up the volume. So our comma is separating our dependent from our independent clause in this sentence, in this complex sentence. Make sure you have that example down. All right, so now I'm going to share my screen back with you, and we're going to look at some examples of where we need to add commas and where those commas are going to go. Okay, remember we've just talked about using commas in a list or a series. We talked about using commas in compound sentences with two independent clauses and complex sentences with an independent and a dependent, and also using semicolons when we're talking about dates, okay? Semicolons and commas. So let's look at some examples. Okay. Identify the correct punctuation to use in each sentence, okay? So what we're going to do is we're going to rewrite this sentence with the correct punctuation. And this is exactly what you guys are going to do in your examples, so that Google form that you turn in to me, you're going to rewrite the sentence with the correct punctuation. So these 5 sentences here are missing punctuation. They're missing commas or semicolons, and we need to rewrite the sentence with the commas and the semicolons in the correct place, okay? So let's look at number 1. I'd like to read another chapter book, but I don't have time, okay? So most of you, when I read that, you might tell me where you're pausing, and you might already know where that comma needs to go, okay? Well, let's look at what kind of sentence this is, okay? I'd like to read another chapter, I don't have time, okay? Both of those clauses can stand by themselves. So those are 2 independent clauses. I'd like to read another chapter. That can stand on its own, okay? I don't have time. That can stand on its own, okay? So this is an example of a compound sentence. Remember, a compound sentence is joined by a comma and a conjunction, okay? So our comma is going to need to go right here before but, okay? So what we're going to do is just off to the side. Okay, we're going to rewrite this whole entire sentence correctly. So I'd like to read another chapter, comma, but I don't have time, period, okay? So notice how I rewrote that sentence and I put the comma in the correct place. The comma needs to go before the but, okay? All right, now let's look at the second one. My favorite genres are science fiction, fantasy, and mysteries. Okay, so if we notice here, we have a list: science fiction, fantasies, and mysteries. Okay, so our commas in this sentence need to go in between the different reasons, in between the different items in that list. Okay, so I'm going to need, let me exit out this one. I'm going to need to rewrite the sentence with the commas and separating those different things in that list. So my favorite genres are science fiction, comma, fantasy, comma, and mysteries. Okay, notice how I put a comma in between each of those items in that list. Okay. All right, let's look at the next one. Although Casey likes to read, he didn't like the new book. All right, so we know that we're gonna need to add some form of a comma here, but we need to figure out where that is. Okay, so let's look at this sentence and figure out what kind of sentence is it. Although Casey likes to read, he didn't like the new book. Okay, so we have one part of the sentence, although Casey likes to read, and we have another part, he didn't like the new book. Okay, well, if we look at this is going to be an example of a complex sentence, because although Casey likes to read, Although Casey likes to read what? That does not make sense on its own. So that's going to be a dependent clause, okay? But he didn't like the new book does make sense on its own, okay? So that's going to be an independent clause. So we have a dependent and an independent, which is going to give us a complex sentence, okay? Remember, our complex sentence needs to have a comma between the independent and the dependent. So our comma is going to go right there in this sentence, okay? So I'm going to rewrite the sentence with the comma. So although Casey likes to read, comma, he didn't like the new book. Okay. So our comma for that one is going to be going between the independent and dependent clause right before that he. Okay, so make sure you have your comma there. Okay. Now let's look at this one. Book clubs meets on Thursday, March 22nd, Tuesday, March 27th, and Friday, April 2nd. Okay, so immediately it should jump out at you that we have dates here. So we're going to need both commas and semicolons. Okay, so let's see. We know that we're going to need semicolons and commas when we're talking about the day and the month. And then our semicolon needs to separate each day that we're talking about. So I'm just gonna kind of underline that part of the sentence because we know that's what we're gonna need to change, okay? So our commas, let's first put in our commas. Our commas are gonna need to go between the day and the month, okay? So let's pop this up here. So book club meets on Thursday, comma, March 22nd. Now I'm going to my next date, okay? So now I need to put a semicolon, okay? I need you to find the semicolon on your keyboard. I know, guys, it might be a little difficult, but it should be on the second row of letters, okay? And it should be right there. You should see it. There should be a colon and a semicolon, okay? So there's a semicolon, Tuesday, comma, March 27th. Now another semicolon because I'm going to my last date. And Friday, comma, April 2nd. And don't forget your period at the end, okay? So for this one, you needed both commas and semicolons, okay? So go back and look at this one, okay? Because you need both commas and semicolons. Commas separating the day from the month, semicolons separating the 3 days. Okay? And let's look at our last one. I want you to read number 5 on your own and see if you can figure out where that comma is going to go there. Okay, so let's look at 5. It says Tom enjoys action stories and Elisa likes romance stories. Okay, so if we notice here, okay, this is going to be a compound sentence because we have Tom enjoys action stories. That makes sense on its own. Elisa likes romance stories. That makes sense on its own. Okay, so remember our comma is going to need to go before the conjunction. Your conjunction in this sentence is and. Okay, so you're going to need to put a comma in between stories and. Okay, so we're going to go off to the side, write that sentence correctly. So Tom enjoys action stories, comma, and Elisa likes romance stories. Okay. So our comma there needs to be between stories and because we're separating those two independent clauses there, guys, with a comma and a conjunction word. All right, so I hope that this was helpful, and I would love to see you guys use this in your writing, okay? Especially, like I said, in those introduction paragraphs where you're separating your 3 reasons, okay? Because it is a series, because you're telling me those 3 reasons. So you could use commas there. And I also wanted to do this because a lot of us in our writing, we could be using these commas and we're not. So let's kind of start to use these skills in grammars that we're learning in grammar and put them in our writing, okay? So you're gonna have a Google form where you're gonna do exactly what we just did. You need to rewrite the sentence, putting the commas in the correct place, and there is one that you're going to have to put semicolon and commas, okay? So I hope this was helpful, and see you guys later. Have a good day.